Okay, thank you all for being here. It is a big honor to introduce and to have Dr. Sanders from Texas A&M here today to talk to us about the origins of the Beefmaster and the source cattle grandfather used and the way in which he crossed them, which was more out of necessity than anything else. And why he may have inadvertently stumbled on something. Anyway, I would like Dr. Sanders to give us a brief history of his relationship with Paul and how they met with O.D. Butler at Texas A&M. Yes.
It is a real pleasure to be here today. When I first met Dale, actually, I'm not 100% sure we met at the King Ranch Symposium. I think that was in 1987. But both Dale and I gave talks then, and something I said that he thought, I guess, was worthwhile. But at any rate, he was visiting Dr. O.D. Butler there after the Butler was our Vice Chancellor for Agriculture, and he had asked me to come over and visit with him, and we had a good visit that day, and continued over the years. But he was a great man, I think, as all of you know. I'd talked to Alex about when he asked me if I'd come and give a talk about some things that we've done at A&M that I think throw some real light on the way that Mr. Tom started the breed way back in the 1930s. So I got a picture of a bull down at the Laster Ranch and at Falfur's back in the 1940s, and I'm going to, after you told me how to do everything, Maddie, I'm afraid I'm going to hit the wrong one because it says end. And I'm so sorry. Okay, it said end on it, so that's what was worrying me. Okay, I was seeing that when it had error, but it said end, and I wasn't finished yet. But this is a page. This is a page out of something that Mr. Tom wrote in 1961, and I'm going to come to some. I'm going to break it down into smaller pieces where I don't think you can read it from what's up there right now. But I'm going to talk about it, and I hope you can read the smaller pieces as I've cut it apart and put it where to look at it. And from that, I hope you can see it. And I know it's still a little bit small, but we got 3 different monitors for it. But this is from that thing that was written by Mr. Tom Laster back in 1961. And as I think, and I've got some notes in here later to say commented on it, but I think all of you probably know that that Tom Laster was at Princeton working on his degree whenever his dad died, and I think it was in 1931. And his mother and his uncle had control of the cattle, but they neither one wanted to take responsibilities for continuing. And the cattle that he started with was, first of all, the Brahman herd, a Brahma herd as he referred to it, that was developed by his father. Ed Laster had really started breeding Brahman cattle way back in 1908. The most important importations up until that time had been in 1906, and he bought some cattle from that original foundation herd in 1908. At any rate, he had developed a herd of commercial Brahman cows in South Texas at Falfur's. And at that time, after his dad had died and all the creditors had moved in to take things away from him, his uncle L.D. Miller had control of that herd. And then there was the other herd, the Hereford herd, that was developed by his father, that was owned by his mother. And then the source number 3 were registered shorthorn bulls. 2 of them were bulls he'd bought earlier in 1931, and then he bought another one the pole bull in 1936. I'm going to come back and talk about those bulls in a little bit more. And then a registered foal Hereford bull he'd bought in the late 1930s. So, again, continued in his discussion. Whenever he got back from Princeton and started working with the cattle, he crossed the Brahman bulls out of Brahman herd on the Hereford cows and the Hereford bulls out of that herd on the Brahman cows. And then he did cross those two with each other. Now, again, remember, this is cutting and pasting from that previous one. Sources number 1 and 3 were crossed, and sources number 1 and 4 were crossed. Well, 1 and 2 were, again, the Brahman herd and the Hereford herd. And by the numbers that they were calling them, the number 2 was the Hereford herd, number 1 was the Brahman herd, number 3 was the Shorthorn bulls he bought later. So just keeping myself straight on the numbers. So yeah, he crossed both the Brahman bulls on the Hereford cows and the Hereford bulls on the Brahman cows, but he bred the Shorthorn bulls to the Brahman cows. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, that's where the real significance on this comes in. And then 1 and 4 were crossed. That's those, again, I'm getting the different numbers mixed up on them. That's the polled Hereford bulls that were crossed back on the Brahman cows as well. And then he took the crossbred calves that were produced out of it, both bulls that he kept and the females that were kept, and then they were run together in what he called a crossbred herd. And somewhere along in here he says it was treated as a breed from the beginning because the cattle that were produced in it with the cattle that were used to continue the breed that became the Beefmaster. And then I've combined the other part in a little bit different order in this next slide. So again, the number 1 was the Brahman herd, Brahma herd as he called it. Number 2 was the registered herd, and then he crossed the polled Hereford bulls with the one registered polled Hereford bull. So 1 and 2 were crossed, and 1 and 4 were crossed, and then number 3, those registered Shorthorn bulls were bred to the Brahman cows, and then the calves out of that were used as primarily as bulls, but the females went in there also. Now, that tells the story in a broad way, but some details that Kathy Probant wrote in her little booklet several years ago, printed in '78. That's getting to be a long time ago also. But she gave a little bit more detail and some things that really shed some light on it, especially in some of the things I'm going to talk about of some work that we did at A&M in the last few years. Now again, this right here is just quoted directly. I've left a few things out to try to get it to fit on the slide what we wanted to talk about. But started in the early 1930s by Tom Laster, but they went back to cattle that his dad had raised, and at the one time his dad had been just a tremendously large operator in South Texas, but then he operated on borrowed money. And then whenever he died, the creditors moved in, and again we talked about what was left after Mr. Tom came down to work on it. And again, I emphasize I left a line in there, and a registered Hereford herd. This is just a couple of pictures of pages of page 295 and 296 in the 1920 Hereford herd book. Just illustrating that Mr. Tom was, Mr. Ed, I should say now, Ed Laster in 1920 was registering Hereford cattle. He was active in the Hereford Association, and the registered herd were being registered and kept as a registered herd of Hereford cattle. Just close up, just showing again, that's off of one of those pages where Ed C. Laster listed as the breeder on those cattle. Again, I commented on it earlier. Mr. Ed started with introduced Brahman cattle into Deep South Texas in 1908, and again used Brahman bulls on his Shorthorn and Hereford cows. And now there's a line or something left off. I know what it's supposed to say, but there's something left off on here that got cut off as we transferred in here, I guess. But at any rate, he'd crossed Brahman with the Shorthorn, and he had the herd they called the Muertos herd that was famous all through South Texas. They were on the ranch that ended up being sold to the King ranches, the Encino division, and these were the Shorthorn Brahman cross cattle in that herd, and real favorite of Mr. Tom's, and that he remembered those cattle later on when he had the control of the Brahman herd. He was looking for an opportunity to put some Shorthorn blood back into it. And again, comments we've already said. There were 350 cows in the Brahman herd and 150 cows in the Hereford herd out of the large numbers of cattle that his father had had. Again, Neither one of them wanted the responsibility of continuing with the breeding program. So Tom came back from Princeton and managed the operation. I think it was for $75 a month at that time. And in some other places where it's been written, part of what he was doing was delivering milk. They, as you may probably know, many of you know, they had a large Jersey herd also, and he was delivering milk on the weekends as part of the things he was doing to try to keep the ranch going. Is again part of the story that I remember. Again, basically what was said in the earlier thing, he crossed the Brahman bulls on the Hereford cows and Hereford bulls on the Brahman cows. But again, he remembered that famous Muertos herd that had been sold many years ago. By the way, just an interesting story related to that. When they sold what became the Encino division of King Ranch to the Clayburghs, they offered to sell them the cows for $40 a head that were in there out of that Shorthorn Brahman Cross herd. And they didn't want to pay that much for them. They said they were going to put straight Hereford cows in there, and they didn't want to pay that much for them. Well, so they gathered them up and sent them through the stockyards at San Antonio, and the cows ended up netting $41 and something. So they brought more as commercial cows than what they had offered to sell them to the King Ranch for. But again, outstanding set of cows that Mr. Tom remembered was he was taking over the control of those cattle. So in 1931, he talked his mother and his uncle and letting him buy some Shorthorn bulls. It was during the Depression. Times were tough. He could only afford 2 bulls. He bought them from John Empson from Beeville. I don't know if any of you all are here from B County or Live Oak County. I was raised about 12 miles from where John Empson's place was, and for those of us down there, we'd say it's from Clairville rather than Beeville. But there's not anything there. It was just a community more than anything else. It was a gin, I think, at one time. But at any rate, Mr. John had pretty well quit raising cattle by the time I was old enough to really know very much about them. But I say really know much about them. I guess the last ones that I know of him raising the straight Shorthorn cattle would have been somewhere around 1960 or so. But at any rate, the story I wanted to tell, though, it would have been the summer of 1963. I was 17 years old. And I went with 2 ag teachers and looking at cattle at the O'Brien Ranch. And looked at some cattle. If y'all know the place, it's on the left-hand side going from Beeville to Refugio. And a big place. And we looked at a bunch of cattle there, half-load cattle. And then we went over to the other side of Refugio, up towards Greta, like you're going to go to Victoria. And the place that the O'Briens had there, and we saw this set of cows, Shorthorn Brahman Cross cows. Best set of crossbred cows I think I've ever seen. Well, I'll say it, they were the best set of crossbred cows I've ever seen, and that's 50-something years ago. Those cows also were by out of commercial Brahman cows of the O'Briens, but by bulls that had been bought from John Empson. So whenever I started putting it together, that those bulls that had such a big contribution came from John Empson, and they were bred Shorthorn cows. Bred to Brahman cows. It brought back a lot of memories of some awful good cattle that I'd seen that were bred very much like that some years later. At any rate, Tom bred those 2 bulls the top Brahman cows. So the very top Brahman cows were bred to those 2 bulls he got. And so he ended up with, he had a lot more of the Hereford Brahman crosses than he did the Shorthorn Brahman crosses because he only had 2 of those. Remember, there were 350 of those cows in the Brahman herd. He only had 2 of those Shorthorn bulls, and he had all the Hereford bulls he wanted to use. Oops, I went back, I went hit. Okay, now, the Shorthorn, this again from Kathy Brobant, the Shorthorn cross bulls were coming from the top Brahman cows and were better than the Hereford Brahman cross cows. And he used those Brahman cross, Shorthorn Brahman cross bulls on the Hereford Brahman cross cows, and he liked that combination of the 3 breeds combined. Again, Tom used the outstanding Shorthorn Brahman cross bulls on Hereford Brahman cross cows, and my note at the bottom, remember that those Shorthorn Brahman cross bulls were by Shorthorn bulls and out of Brahman cows. I'm going to emphasize that, and then I'm going to say, well, we'll have another slide first, but exact percentages weren't known, but again, they knew that they put as many of those Shorthorn Brahman cross bulls in on what were both kinds of Brahman Hereford cross cows. Some of them are Brahman bulls out of Hereford cows, and some of them the reverse. Again, even though they didn't know exactly, they figured they're about half Brahman, and the rest of it equally divided between Hereford and Shorthorn, and probably a little bit less than half Brahman. Again, noting again, Tom used the outstanding Shorthorn Brahman cross bulls on the Hereford Brahman cross cows, and the Shorthorn Brahman cross bulls were by Shorthorn bulls and out of Brahman cows. So my question, there are about quarter Hereford, quarter Shorthorn, half Brahman. Why does that make any difference? Why am I making such a big deal out of it? And I'll try to explain to you. So what I have here is that let's sort of look at the idea of the whole concept of developing new breeds, which such as it was the case for Tom Laster in 1931. So if we think about the development of a new breed, obviously blending the characteristics. And everybody recognizes the Beefmaster having a blend of those characteristics with Brahman and Shorthorn and Hereford. But at least another aspect of it, and this is something that really never got in the forefront much until the 1970s, is that hopefully in that composite breed you retain some of the hybrid vigor that you had in the original cross. And then a few comments about hybrid vigor. It's a mount that the first cross, the F1, exceeds the average of the performance of the straight breds, and it's most important, it's highest and by far most important for fertility traits. And then emphasizing here in red, it's 2 to 3 times higher in Brahman or Bos indicus crosses with such as the Brahman when crossed with a Bos taurus breed such as the Hereford or the Shorthorn than it is between 2 Bos taurus breeds or another one that got cut off a little bit on this screen. No, yeah, it's cut off the same on yours as on mine. Than it is between 2 Bos taurus breeds or 2 Bos indicus breeds such as the Brahman and the lower. Okay, then another term, hybrid vigor retention. So hybrid vigor retention, just the amount of hybrid vigor that you're able to maintain in some new when crossbred animals are bred to each other, such as in a continuing cross, a continuing group such as the Beefmaster. Now, there have been some research, and I'll comment a little bit about it, that there's been some research on looking at hybrid vigor retention, just how much hybrid vigor is retained whenever you crossbreds with crossbreds. And from the results that have been found among Bos taurus crosses, such as Hereford and Shorthorn or Charolais or Limousine, that those cross with each other, that you can predict the hybrid vigor pretty well from and I have it here in terms of heterozygosity. Heterozygosity, probably all of you know, just means that the 2 genes that the particular pair are different from each other. Well, in reality, what we're talking about here, whenever based on, at least on predictions, you'd have 1 gene from one breed and 1 gene from the other breed, and to the extent that they're different, well, you're going to have heterozygosity associated with it. A lot more than if both genes came from the same breed. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but there's been plenty of research that among Bos taurus breeds, you can estimate it pretty well. Just from the combination you expect to have 1 gene from each of the 2 breeds. Most complete study of it was at the Meat Animal Research Center at Clay Center, Nebraska. But again, Bos taurus blooded composites. All of them were part continental European and part British, and all of them Bos taurus blooded cattle. That study was started in 1978. I had a real close relationship with that. Dr. Keith Gregory, who started off as the director of the Meat Animal Research Center, moved down from director in 1977. He spent 6 months with us at A&M during the time he was getting everything planned for this study. We spent lots of time talking about it, so I'm pretty familiar with that from the very beginning. But again, remember, these composite breeds were composed only of Bos taurus or European parental breeds. Yeah, I'm including European and British. Continental European and British. Now, I said a while ago that pretty well documented that as long as you're looking among Bos taurus breeds, you can predict the amount of hybrid vigor you keep in the later generations of crosses pretty well from the hybrid vigor in the original crosses and a fraction of the genes you'd expect to be and have 1 from one breed and 1 from the other in later generations. Well, take the example I have here. If Hereford average is 78% calf crop wean, depending on where you are, and the straight Angus are 80%, and the F1 cows, and that makes them have an average of 79. Those F1, whether you bred Hereford bulls to Hereford bulls to Angus cows or Angus bulls to Hereford cows, F1s would have about 4 percentage points higher. That's pretty well the kind of figures that you see for reproductive traits among Bos taurus breeds when we cross them with each other. And then again, based on research that's been done, that kind of cross, you breed those F1 cows to F1 bulls, you expect to retain about half of that hybrid vigor. Again, note at the bottom, F1 bull bred to an F1 cow just means you get an F2. And then another example, and this is one that you've seen from another breed, another American breed, talking about 47% of the hybrid vigor retained. If you make a 3/8 Hereford, 5/8 Angus crossbred, and then breed those to each other, then you expect to retain 15, 30 seconds. It's just a little bit less than a half of the hybrid vigor of the first cross. And again, this other breed, you see them sometimes advertising, this breed has 47% of the hybrid vigor of the breed. Well, we'll come back to that. Now, at Clay Center, Meat Animal Research Center, they'd have liked to have a Bos indicus, Bos taurus blooded composite. But in order to do it, they had controls. In other words, and one of their composites was a quarter each of Hereford, Shorthorn, Simmental, and Gilby. Well, they had purebred herds of all four of those, and they had them where they could compare them as they're under the same years and the same conditions with the cattle that they produced when they crossed them and produced what they call a Mark II. In order to do that with a Bos indicus blooded breed, they needed to have a straight Bos indicus breed there. They calved early enough in the year, it would have just been a disaster to have straight Brahman or any other straight Bos indicus breed there at Clay Center. So they said they just can't do it. It'll have to be done on somewhere else where you can raise straight Bos indicus cattle. So again, they didn't do it. Before we talk something about what we did, then repeating something from Clay Center, from the GPU, germplasm utilization study. They found a significant fraction of the original hybrid vigor could be retained even in later generations where you bred, crossbred to start a new line. Remember, only Bos taurus breeds were evaluated, no Bos indicus breeds were used. And also remember that when you cross a Bos indicus breed like the Brahman with a Bos taurus breed like the Hereford or Shorthorn, we get 2 or 3 times as much hybrid vigor as we do between 2 Bos taurus breeds. So, example with Brahman and Hereford. Again, depending on where you are, if you had the same average of 78 we used a while ago in the Hereford, straight Brahman cows have lots of good things about them, but the reproductive rates are not that high on the average. But you cross them, if you have an average of 76% for straight Hereford and straight Brahman, that F1 cow under the same kind of conditions, calf crop percentage of 88% will be common, 12% hybrid vigor. Comment was made earlier. 2 to 3 times as much hybrid vigor in Bos indicus, Bos taurus crosses as between 2 Bos taurus crosses. We don't have enough experience in this country with Bos indicus crosses, but in Brazil, certainly lots of it's known there. Note again, before 1994, hybrid vigor retention and crosses between Bos indicus and Bos taurus breeds either had not been adequately evaluated or the results were inconclusive and sometimes pretty contradictory. Comment here about work done in Australia. This work started in the 1950s, and then there were several different reports of it. The first one I know of that was reported in 73, then a couple of them later. And they all reported extremely low calving percentages in what they call the Brahman cross cattle at Rockhampton. I got a picture there, some cows at Rockhampton. Probably that Brayford-looking cow in the middle is probably one of their what they call their Brahman crosses. But this picture that I took down there, and it was just a group of cattle together. What did they find? They had high, for their country, now I'll talk about in a minute where that is and just what the tough conditions that they're under. But for their conditions, a real high reproductive rate in their F1 cows. And that was what they're calling F1 cows was Brahman bulls bred to Shorthorn Hereford cross cows, what they call their British type. Again, about 81%. But crossed them with Brahman, and reproductive rate was very, very low. The F1 cow is very high. F1, then again, right there I have 81%, a very high percentage on those cows. But when they crossed the crossbred to crossbred, very, very low productivity. They were down around 60% calving rate in those second generation half-bloods. Conclusions being made at that time, you cross these Bos indicus blooded cattle with each other, and you lose all the hybrid vigor, and maybe you lose a little bit more. I didn't believe that. We had breeds like the Beefmaster that were doing well in this country. I didn't believe you lost all that value in those crossbred cattle. By the way, this next slide just showing, this is in the town of Rockhampton, just right there next to the Belmont Station where that work was done. Just showing that it's right on the Tropic of Capricorn. Just think about your geography, that's on the other side of the equator, of course. but the same distance from the equator would be just north of Cuba, or maybe 100 miles, 50 miles probably north of Tampico, Mexico. So we're talking about pretty tropical to subtropical conditions where this work was done. Again, that thing at the bottom, just a sort of a document thing there in Rockhampton, showing you right your own line of tropical Capricorn, and the Belmont Station just right outside of Rockhampton. Now, there was some work done at the station in Florida. Max Peacock did it. It looked a little bit more promising than the Australian work, but the work they did in Florida was just based on palpation records. They never did report. He died before it ever got reported, actually, but it never was reported on either calving rate or weaning rate. But they did show closer to what you might expect in British cattle, had found in British cattle, on the work that they did. The Brahman Angus second generation half-bloods had a little bit lower performance than you'd predict based on the parents. And their second generation, they have it at the bottom there. The second generation Charolais Brahman cross cows actually did a little bit better than you'd predict based on all of the work that had been done prior to that point. I know it's after lunchtime, and I'm trying to do everything I can to keep some of you awake. Some of them having a little bit of trouble on some of you, but I hope I don't bore you too much if you go to sleep. I'll discuss those results from Queensland and Florida a little bit later after we talk about some of the work that we did at McGregor, Texas. In 1994, Wendell Shrunk was still secretary of the Brahman Association, and we did a carcass evaluation for them at McGregor. It was somewhat similar to the one we did for Beefmaster Association after Wendell had gone to work for the Beefmaster Association. Some of you were probably familiar with that. But in 1994, we had a set of real good, in fact, Brahman Hereford cross heifers had been produced that were mates to those steers that we were evaluating for the carcass traits. We made the deal with them when we did it. We'll evaluate steers for them, but we're going to keep the heifers and use them. And so we had those good heifers that produced by those bulls. It was considered to be top bulls in the breed because they were people were paying to get them evaluated. So before those heifers were ready to breed, and next year we decided we're going to do something that as I said, that they'd wanted to do at Clay Center, to evaluate hybrid vigor retained in Boss Indicus by Boss Taurus blooded cattle, and we started with those heifers to begin with. Now, from the very beginning, the idea was to try to evaluate hybrid vigor retained in these crosses between Boss Indicus and Boss Indicus were Brahman on these original ones, although we used some lower in some different parts of the study, and to produce Brahman Angus and Brahman Hereford second generation half-bloods, F2s. Now, that first year we had those heifers. Our Brahman cows at McGregor had been bred to Hereford bulls the previous year, so in addition to having those Brahman sired calves out of Hereford cows, we also had Hereford sired calves out of Brahman cows. So since we had them, we decided to evaluate those second generation half-bloods all four ways you could do it. With Brahman sired bulls on Hereford sired cows, Brahman sired bulls on Brahman sired cows, Hereford sired F1 bulls on Hereford sired F1 cows, and Hereford sired bulls on Brahman F1 cows. All four different ways you could do it of how you make that second generation half-blood, depending on what the grandparents were. So again, if BH means that the bull sired by a Brahman bull and out of a Hereford cow, well, BH bulls bred to BH cows, and BH bulls bred to HB cows, where HB just means the cows were sired by Hereford bulls out of Brahman cows. Then both kinds of them, of the cows bred to the Hereford sired F1 bulls. We had some Brahman sired calves out of our Hereford cows that we kept as bulls, but we didn't have any of we had not kept any bull calves out of those Brahman cows that year, so we did buy some Hereford sired bulls from three different ranches with top cattle. Now, let me emphasize, until that time, I don't think anybody did, and I know I didn't think you'd expect there to be any difference on how you made those original crosses. It's F1 bulls bred to F1 cows. I didn't think it made any difference whether they were sired, whether either the bulls or the cows were sired by Hereford bulls or out of Brahman cows, by Hereford bulls or by Brahman bulls. Again, we didn't expect there to be any difference among those four different types. The first Brahman and Hereford F1 heifers were both ways, born in 1994. First, second generation half-bloods or F2s were born in 96, and they had their first calves in 98. So we started in 94, we did 98 before we ever had calves out of those cows. That really the interesting part of the deal. All calves were born in the spring, and we did give the cows a chance to miss a calf. But one missed before they were 14 years old. After they were 14 years old, any skip, and they were culled. So again, that was our program. This is just a picture of an F1 bull and some F1 cows. Some of them sired by Hereford bulls and some of them sired by Brahman bulls. All four of them run together, and all four of those F2 cows run in the same pasture. Just a comment or two. I've heard some people say that they can tell whether they're sired by a Brahman bull or by a Hereford bull by looking at them. I've challenged people when they ask me that, and never found one person that could really tell the difference. They back down whenever you put them on the spot on it, and I can't tell them apart, and I can't tell the F1s apart either. That's significant because it took us a while to really realize what we were getting on this thing. Again, there's a Brahman sired cow at the top left and a Hereford sired cow at the bottom right. Both of them cows we produced in that study. And then it was a little bit later before we started realizing just how important those different types of second generation half-bloods were. But here's all four kinds of them. The red white-faced cow on the top by a Brahman sired bull and out of a Brahman sired cow. Then the chocolate colored cow on the right by a Brahman sired bull and out of a Hereford sired cow. Then a Hereford sired bull out of a Brahman cross cow, the brindle cow with the nub horn on the bottom left. And then the bald-faced cow with the speckling behind her shoulder. By a Hereford sired bull and out of a Hereford sired cow. But again, in each case, that's one out of 12 or 13 that we had of those different kinds that we evaluated for lifetime production. Again, we didn't recognize any real difference between them in those early years. They were all run together. I really wasn't expecting there to be difference among those four different kinds. What we wanted to do was compare the average of all four of those kinds with the average of the two other kinds and see, well, just how effective should you be able to do developing a new breed from a crossbred base like it on a Bos indicus blooded breed. When we got a good analysis done of that data, all of a sudden that looked like the most important thing, and we'll talk about that more. So 2004, 6 years after the first ones of those second generation half-bloods had their first calves, we'd analyzed it far enough, and it's starting to fall apart looking real clear that there were some differences that we hadn't anticipated. By 2011, just about all those cows were dead by then. A few of the best ones were still around. But we got a very thorough analysis then, and that's the results we'll be looking at here. There were 50 or more of the cows in each one of the comparison herds. But again, point out, that comparison herd for those F2 cows was all together, there were 50 of them. So there's either 12 or 13 of each one of those types. If we'd have known then what we know now, and that's always good if you can know something ahead of time. But if we'd have known then what we'd had now, we'd have had 50 of each one of those kinds, so we could get even a better comparison than what we did. We got a study going on. I sort of thought Lance Bauer might be here for this thing. If he ever gets around to getting some time to go back on his graduate work, he's supposed to be looking at some stuff we have on some Angus Nelore, second generation half-blood. At any rate, we had 50 of those different types, but again, that'd be 50 total of the F2 cows, 50 total of the F1 cows. And all of them were produced at the McGregor station, and all of them evaluated at the McGregor station. Again, I'm just saying in that slide the same thing I just got through saying. 50 total of F1 cows, 50 total of the second generation half-bloods. There were 34 of those F1 cows that were sired by Brahman bulls and out of Hereford cows, and 18 of them were the reverse cross. And then in those second generation half-bloods, F2s, we had either 12 or 13 of each of the different types. They were evaluated for their whole life production, just as I just said earlier. Talked about that. They were all exposed to calf as yearlings, and they were culled if they got crippled or something, or got sick, bad sick, and couldn't get well. But except for the straight Brahmins, they had to have at least 2 failures to be culled. On the Brahmins, just to keep our herd intact, average reproductive performance is low enough. We had to give them a little bit more chance to get a better measure of lifetime production on the straight Brahman cows. just something there about the years they were born. And pretty much the way we were doing it, we'd use the Brahman sired bulls on 1 year on our half-blood cows and the Hereford sired bulls on another set, on the next year on the same set of cows. So they alternated years. Again, it's so easy after the fact to go back and say, gosh, if we'd known this, we'd have had larger numbers of them, and we'd have had them done separately where everything being born all the same year. It's awful easy to look back and say what you ought to have done, but that's what we have. And the two tops F2 cows by BH bulls were born in 97 and 98, and both two types and the two types sired by the Hereford sired bulls born in 96, 97, and 98. So 97 is the only year that we had both kinds of them being born at the same time. Started calving about 10th of February, then calved till about the May 10th each year. And we'd start a little bit later on our Brahman bulls. First of all, the gestation length's a little bit longer on the Brahmans. We typically turn bulls out just a little bit later because you get a wet norther in March on the Brahman cow with a baby calf. You lose too many calves. We try to get them a little bit better chance with calving just a little bit later. Oh, the calves were weaned in October or November, except in 2011, which is, as any of you in Texas know, that's a terrible year. And we had to wean a little bit earlier because of the drought. Emphasizing again, did not expect there to be any difference in these 4 different types of second generation half-bloods. Idea was to compare the whole group of those F2 cows with F1 cows. But it wasn't designed to test the differences among those 4 types. But again, as we just got through saying, as we're getting ready to talk about more, the difference among them was more important than how they compared to anything else. Not designed to look those differences, and again, just what I said. Differences among those 4 different types, especially among 2 of them, were the most interesting for sure, and I'd certainly think the most important thing that we found out in the study. The rest of it is all shown in these following tables. Now, I hope you can see that, and it gets pretty small. I've got another slide or 2 later to where I think it's a little bit bigger. What we have at the top there is a straight Brahman, and average calf crop percent weaned out of those straight Brahman cows was 69.1. Straight Hereford cows, 73.8. And then the 2 F1 type cows have the Brahman sired first there where that bracket is, and then the Hereford sired F1 just below it. They had 80.5 and 85.1. Average those 2 together, that's about almost 14% higher than it was for the straight breds. And then at the next one, again, we're going to look at another slide where I've got this where hopefully you can see it a little bit better on the screen. I didn't realize it's going to be quite this small whenever we got the screen the screen that we're using. But if we start down there with where all those brackets overlap, the first one is Brahman sired F1 bulls on Brahman sired cows, then Brahman sired F1 bulls on Hereford sired Brahman cows, and then the 2 bottom ones, Hereford sired bulls on Hereford sired cows, Hereford sired bulls on Brahman sired cows. The F1s were 13.7%, or about 14% higher than the straight bred cows. Then look at that next one down there, those next 2 below it. Those are the second generation half-bloods that had Brahman sired sires. Remember what we said about the stuff in Australia. They said that those second generation half-bloods that they had terrible production, terrible reproduction. Down there is lower than what the straight breds were. Didn't really believe it was true. Thought they just didn't have a good test on it. Well, we found exactly the same thing for that kind of second generation half-blood cows. Now look at the 2 bottom ones. Again, we're going to have that where we have the numbers bigger in a minute, I hope. But the next 2 lines, the 2 bottom lines, with those Hereford sired bulls on Hereford sired cows, 87.8. That's higher than either one of the F1 type cows. And the Hereford sired bulls on the Brahman sired cows, 90%. Both of them higher than what it was in the F1 cows. So in those second generation half-bloods produced that way with Hereford sired bulls on the crossbred cows. So Hereford sired bulls out of Brahman cows, we got extremely high reproductive rates. We're going to come back to that. Maybe that's a little bit better. It got shifted a little bit somehow from my computer to this computer. But the top same thing's repeated again. Again, an average of straight Hereford and straight Brahman, 71.5%. The F1 cows average together a little over 82%. just like the ones from Australia, those with Brahman sired. Well, we hadn't talked about yet too much about how they were produced, but those results right there, the Brahman sired F1 bulls bred to Brahman sired F1 cows, and Brahman sired F1 bulls bred to Hereford sired cows. Very low performance, lower than the average of the straight breds. But those second generation half-blood cows that had Hereford sired sires, way up there, even higher than the F1 cows, by quite a good bit actually. So, started off, didn't expect any difference among these 4 different types of F2 cows. Nobody else did either. I mean, maybe some of y'all are so smart you knew it was going to be this way, but none of us did. We didn't expect there to be any difference among these 4 different ways they're produced. And there's a lot of head scratching. Well, why and what in the world's going on that there's that much difference among them? We'll talk about that a little bit. Again, just right now, looking at the 2 kinds of second generation half-bloods. All these got shifted a little bit, but those with Brahman sired sires, average is 63%. Those with Hereford sired sires, average calf crop percent weaned of about almost 89%. That's 26% difference among them. Unbelievable amount of difference. So what in the world could be going on? Now, just for now, summarizing what I just got through talking about on those slides. Those second generation half-blood cows that were sired by Hereford sired bulls performed extremely well. Based on our results, even better than the F1 cows. By contrast, those that had Brahman sired sires performed very poorly. On our results, even worse than the straight bred cows. Just pretty much mirroring the results of what they'd found in Australia. And we'll talk later about what those cows were. And as I said a few minutes ago, we talked about those results in Queensland and Australia and in Florida after we talked about it. Again, since our F2 cows performed very differently depending on how they were crossed, the obvious question, well, how were those cows produced that were used in those other studies? Well, John, getting ready to say his name, I know him pretty well. That's what happens when you get this old. When I was in Queensland in 2009, I think it was, I made it a point to see him. How were those cows made? Never said in their publications how those second generation half-bloods were made. I figured they had to be by Brahman sired bulls because they didn't have that many Brahman cattle in Australia before 1951. They brought a few in 1937, but just a few. And then they brought most of them in the 1950s. Figured they had to be by Brahman bulls and out of the British cows, but I never had been written. Anyhow, I ran him down, and yes, I was exactly right. That all of their second generation half-bloods were sired by Brahman sired bulls. Remember, ours sired by Brahman sired bulls performed very poorly. Okay, the Brahman Angus cross cows in Florida, remember they didn't perform as well as what you'd predict from what we thought we knew about composites. They were also by the way, I'll talk about it in a minute. Mac Peacock had done that work. He was dead by then. In fact, he was dead by the time they analyzed the data. But yeah, I was verified by talking to Tim Olson, who did the analysis. Yes, all of those Brahman Angus F1 bulls were sired by Brahman bulls and out of Angus cows. The situation for the Brahman Charolais cross bulls that they used to produce the F2 cows is a little bit more complicated. Remember, it's a little bit better than what you predicted from the dominance model, which just means it was a little bit better than half as much hybrid vigor as you'd get in the F1 cows from their analysis. Mac Peacock had done the research. He was dead by the time that we were asking these questions. But what they know had happened was that they didn't have any Brahman cows bred to Angus bulls, so they knew what those bulls were for sure. They were by Brahman bulls bred to Angus cows. But they did have those Brahman bulls bred to Charolais cows and Charolais bulls bred to Brahman cows, and they'd kept some calves of both kinds. And then they'd grow them out through the winters, and the one that made it through the winters the best is the ones he kept as bulls. But no records were retained of what they were. So at least conceptually, some of those could have been by Charolais bulls, not a Brahman cow. At any rate, and remember that was on palpation results anyway. Let's talk about what we have. Again, that just said what I just got through saying. From Olson, figured out how those cattle in Florida were produced. Again, remember those that did pretty well. At least some of those could have been by bulls that were sired by Charolais bulls and not by Brahman bulls. Now, combining the results of what we found with those other studies, I don't think you can keep from concluding that those F2 cows sired by Boss Taurus F1 bull. Now remember that Boss Taurus sired F1 bull out of a Brahman cow. Boss Indica sired F1 bull out of a Hereford cow, in our case. And those with the Boss Indica sires had a much higher performance rate than those with Boss Indica sired sires. If that's the case, what in the world could be going on? Now, got to get you to think a little bit about genetics. And we're finding out in these last few years that there's some things on the X chromosome. Probably most people, and it hadn't been that long that I hadn't really thought much about X chromosomes either. Wouldn't you probably know that a yellow and black colored cat is got a gene of yellow from X chromosome from one of its parents and a gene for black from one of its other parent, and that you don't get any yellow and black tomcats because they only have one X chromosome. That either if the same cats are the same breeding, going to be yellow or black. That's about the extent most of us had thought about sex-linked inheritance before we started thinking about some of the other stuff, some of the birth weight stuff where we find some big difference that seemed to be on the X chromosome. So now let's think about it. Think about where an animal or where we get our chromosomes from. So in the male, in the bull, he's only got one X chromosome. He's got an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Well, he gets a Y chromosome from his sire, he gets X chromosome from his mother, all right? Cow gets an X chromosome from both of them. Now let's think about what we have. An F2 cow, let's take what I have at the top first. So an F2 cow with a Boss Indica sired F1 sire. Now she's going to get an X chromosome from her sire because that's all he's got. If he is sired by a Hereford bull and out of a Brahman cow, then the only X chromosome he got came from that Brahman cow. You make an F2 cow, second generation half-blood cow, she's going to get that X chromosome that came from the Brahman from her sire because that's the only kind he's got. Then from her mother, she's a half-blood cow, and either way, whether she's sired by a Hereford bull or a Brahman bull, she's got an X chromosome from the Brahman and the Hereford. Now, she may transmit a whole X chromosome that came from Brahman, it came from her, in whichever her parent was, it was Brahman, or from the Hereford, or it could be a crossover, and she gets a piece of one from this part came from the Hereford, and a piece of one that came from the Brahman, and a crossed over chromosome. Now, again, trying to get you to think about genetics a little bit. So now think about what you have. For those with a Hereford sired sire, those bulls have an X chromosome, so their daughters are going to have at least one X chromosome, and they're probably going to have on the average another half of a chromosome from Brahman. So those second generation half-blood cows, F2 cows that have Hereford sired sires are going to have 3/4 of their X chromosomes from, on average, 3/4 of at least one, at least half, and on average about 3/4 of their X chromosome having coming from the Brahman. Flip-flop it. Look at the Brahman sired F1 cows. Again, those Brahman sired bulls are going to get their X chromosome from their mother, so they're going to have at least one X chromosome from the Boss Taurus or from the Hereford in that case. And they're probably going to have at least something, and on average half of an X chromosome from their mother as well. So take the two contrasts. So I've got it right there. F2 cow with a Boss Taurus sired F1 sired have it about 3/4 of her X chromosome material from the Boss Indicas. A second generation half-blood cow with a Brahman sired sire would have about 3/4 of her X chromosome material from the Boss Taurus. You got to stop and think about it because you're thinking about what that sire is, but you got to think about where his came from. That the sire of that sire, that sire, the F1 sire, he got his X chromosome from his mother, not from his sire. So again, what would we have? Those cows that performed real well for us were sired by Hereford sired bulls that were out of Brahman cows. So on average, we expect about 3/4 of their X chromosome material to come from the Brahman. The reverse cross, those with Brahman sired sires have about 3/4 of their X chromosome material that came from the Hereford. And so then what would we? We'd have what we just got through saying. Now, if you go back and do a little bit further thing, well, let's talk about why in the world was I paying so much attention about how Tom Laster made those first Beefmaster cattle when we started our talk a little bit earlier today. So, again, we just got through saying. F2 cow with the Boss Taurus sired F1 sire has about 3/4 of her X chromosome material from the Boss Indicas, And based on our results, looked like she got awful high productivity. Quoted word for word from the thing written back in earlier. Tom Laster, Tom was added the Laster. Tom used the outstanding Shorthorn Brahman Cross bulls on Hereford Brahman Cross cows, and the Shorthorn Brahman Cross bulls were by Shorthorn bulls and out of Brahman cows. I hope I've emphasized things enough for you to see the significance of that. Why I was thinking and why I told Alex that I think that the way that those crosses were made. Now, Alex has said he stumbled across it. I don't know if maybe he's smart enough he figured he knew that ahead of time. But however he did it, the high reproductive rate that's been able to be retained in the Beefmaster breed over the years, I certainly think our results indicate that it was whether by choice or by chance, they started off with the opportunity to retain a high enough reproductive rate to let the breed get started and go well. And by the way, I think an obvious question is, well, you bet on those original cows, those first cows that Mr. Tom produced by Shorthorn sired bulls out of Brahman cows, back on those Brahman Hereford cross cows, that those original cows should have had about 3/4 of their X chromosome material from the Bosendicus. Well, that's what those cows should have had. Well, what about those F1 bulls that were used on them? The second generation half-blood bulls, I should say. Well, those second generation half-blood bulls got their X chromosome material from their mothers, and their mothers had one X chromosome from the Brahman and one X chromosome from the Shorthorn, from the Hereford in that case, because that was the mothers there. And so on the average, they'd have about a half of their X chromosome material from the Brahman, about half of it from the Hereford. Well, at any rate, you go through the arithmetic and go across the generations. After a few generations, with those bulls that have about 3/4 of their X chromosome material from the Brahman, cows that have half of it, you end up after a few generations where you're about 2/3 of their X chromosome material from the Brahman. If you do it the other way, you'd have about 2/3 of their X chromosome material from the Hereford. I can't tell you for sure that all of that difference. Now, I'm not make certain you understand. The program of the Beefmaster breed from the beginning of culling every cow that doesn't wean a calf, and I'm not taking anything away from the selection program. Absolutely, that continued the good performance that those cattle had from the beginning. I can't help but believe that the way they started, though, gave them a head start. And again, that's basically the message I had for you with putting our research to it. Alex had asked me to talk about a little bit of other stuff, which I'm happy to do. But does anybody want to discuss anything about that before we go on to that?
So I have a question, Dr.
Yeah.
So your F2s that performed better, they are out of Hereford sired Brahman cows?
Both times. It didn't make any difference how the F1 cow was produced.
Oh,
Whether she was Brahman or...
the F2s?
No. Okay, all right. You said F1 cows. The F1 cows had the Hereford mothers and Brahman sires did perform a little bit better than those Brahman sires and Hereford sires. But the F2s is where our big difference was.
The F2 that has 3/4 of her X chromosome material from the Brahman side, what is she out of?
She is out of either kind of F1 cow and out or by a Hereford sired F1 bull. So think about a Hereford sired F1 bull. Think about where his X chromosome came from. The bull gets a Y chromosome from his sire and an X chromosome from his mother. So if he is Hereford sired and out of a Brahman cow, then he has a Brahman X chromosome.
So the F2 that did not perform as well and had 3/4 out of Hereford, 3/4 of the X chromosome material out of a Hereford, that animal is out of either kind of F1 with a Brahman
sired F1 sire. That's correct. Either kind of it doesn't the kind of sire that those second generation half bloods had overwhelmed everything else. The difference associated with how the mothers of those F2 cows were made the type of F1 cow makes no difference. And again, that's what makes X chromosome look like the important thing, because those F1 cows have hardly any difference among them, where they got one chromosome of both kinds. It appears there's something, and y'all probably tired of listening to what I've said already, but the stuff, many of you I think are aware of the big difference in birth weights you get from using a Brahman bull on a Hereford cow versus a Hereford bull on a Brahman cow. That also is seems to be, and we've looked at this real closely, seems to be associated with the X chromosome. The X chromosome interacts, we're going to get way further into genetics than what probably any of you want to hear talked about today. But imprinted genes, where the effect of whether a gene is basically functioning at a particular time or not, interaction of an imprinted gene with the X chromosome has some big effects, and it goes all the way back to things that were realized way back in the 1920s, that if you cross two different species, now Bos indicus and Bos taurus would be different subspecies. It sounds like different species, but they're really subspecies. When you get something that's different, like an American bison or a buffalo, American buffalo crossing with a cattle, that's a species cross. And it's always the males that's infertile and the females that have some fertility. Nobody really understood exactly how that was all happening until fairly recent times. Again, it's this interaction of something on the X chromosome with an imprinted gene. And that's probably more discussion than what we got time to talk about as far as the genetics of it. But it's certainly, truthfully, if we hadn't been looking and trying to figure out what was happening on those reciprocal F1 calves on birth weight, probably would have never really dawned on me, at least, that could be involved here. But then you start looking at it, source of those X chromosomes. Well, good gosh, that's a big difference. What else could we be accounting for? Can't think of anything else that'd be different genetically.
Dr. Sanders,
Yes.
I know there's a negligible, probably statistically insignificant difference between what Alex's question on the cow side of the F1 cow, but there was a little difference. Which one was the better?
Those with Hereford sires and Brahman mothers did a little bit better than those with Brahman sires and Hereford mothers.
Basically the same cross as what the sire that you're saying we need.
Those with, let me say it right. Yes, yes. Those were Hereford sired sires. That's the F2 cows.
Yes.
And it also was the Hereford sired cows that did a little bit better.
Little, not much.
A small difference. And I think it's real, but it's we're talking about a couple of percentage points there versus 15 percentage points on the other. Any questions, comments that you got about this topic?
Where was the study done?
Our stuff was done at McGregor, Texas. McGregor's just a little bit west of Waco. So I guess you know about where Waco is, and so right in the middle of Texas, right in central Texas. So it's hot, humid summers, and can get nasty in the wintertime. But for compared, not as cold as here, of course, but because very often it's humid cold, sometimes it might be more unpleasant than what it is here. A wet northern, pretty nasty in south central Texas.
Dr. Sanders, how long can this closed herd continue without problems?
As many cattle as you have, as long as you're using bulls out of the top cows and using as many bulls as you are. The biggest thing is that gets to a breed developed from crossbreeding or any other breed, really, as far as that goes, is to where you get to where you might not be showing on the pedigree that they're inbred, but you get to the point that everything's related to each other. Even if you don't know the pedigrees, you get to the point where if you're too small a number, as many sires, if you got at least 10 or 15 sires being used, which you've always got more than that, and scattered through the breed, I don't think you've got any danger of that being a problem within the breed. As long as you keep your numbers. If you ever got down where all you could maintain was 50 cows and 2 bulls, well then you start running into problems. As long as you keep the numbers where you have a wide range of bulls being used every year, and a cow's got to have a calf every year before that bull gets born, and you don't use him. You and I have talked about it, and this is if I was going to choose another topic besides what we talked about, probably one I'd harp on the most is, in addition to having a program like you do of keeping bulls, and I know you do a bunch of this, so don't think I'm saying it's something you don't do some of already. But if you also say, well, we're not gonna keep a bull out of a cow unless she's had a perfect record till she's 8 or 10 years old or even older, then you'd put even more. Now, that's that same cow that produced bulls when she was a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, but you didn't know as much about her whenever she's a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old as you do when she's a 10-year-old. So that's the one thing that I'd say that you could do even more, is that puts more pressure on it. Now,
Okay, so when we select our yearling key bulls every year, I should focus more on key bull candidates out of older dams?
to me, that's logical. Now, you know, the two questions you asked me, I think you've got to stop and think about balancing those two to each other, because you're always going to have a smaller number of those old cows, obviously, than you're going to have a younger cow. So you could start, but you know, you can watch that. But yes, that tendency, that preference for those old cows that are still productive. Now, as I said, everybody realizes that's that same cow. And if you'd have kept a bull calf out of her when she's a 2-year-old, that would have been great. But you didn't know when she's a 2-year-old. Maybe you're smart enough that you do, but most of us wouldn't have known when she's a 2-year-old that she's still going to be having calves when she's 14-year-old and having good calves when she's a 14-year-old.
She could potentially fail the next year.
She could fail the next year, and that's what worries me the most. Is if you put, especially, and I don't think you do, but especially if you put too much emphasis on growth in those young bulls, well, then that heifer that's milking heavy enough that she's weaning heavy calves as a 2-year-old, we all know she's going to have, that cow that milked heavy as a 2-year-old got some tendency to be the one that does get bred back in next year.
So when we're looking at our yearling bull candidates, we know the ones which are out of first calf heifers. And if that first calf heifer, who was the mother of one of those candidates, did not breed back with her first calf at side, we call that the biggest hurdle of her lifetime. He is eliminated from consideration.
So that's already taken out of consideration. You're already doing that. So you've taken out the big step that would worry me. By the way, I think you need to write that more into some of the stuff that you put out about that. I think that's a very important topic that I haven't seen it written. I don't doubt it a bit. In fact, you told me that you give some preference to those bulls out of those older cows. But I think that's another strong point of the last year program. That you don't just say, well, she's had a calf every year, because if she hadn't got bred back whenever you look at those yearling bulls, you've already taken that into account because she didn't breed for the next calf.
Right. We don't want a yearling key bull out of a one-hit wonder.
I agree totally. You know, again, if you and all I'm saying is I'd also prefer not to keep one out of the one that was a 2-hit.
Okay.
You can take it a step further.
You can go further. Is all I'm saying.
Potentially never keep one out of the cow mix.
Yeah, but as I said, you know, that's a whole lot easier to do than you get out there and you got this real good calf out of that 5 or 6 year old cow, and you're going to have those. She's at a prime of her life right then, of course.
So some people in the Beefmaster world want me to chase cow families, and I'm not. I don't agree with. I don't agree that we can identify the best cow, and we just need to turn them all out and let them do what they're.
Let them do it themselves. I mean, I agree with you, but then like the article that your dad had, I don't know, 6 or 8, 10 years ago, the pronghorn cow that was, I think she was 13 years old, and all the stuff that she'd done. Gosh, you know, if it were me, I'd have a hard time to not keep up with that and know that to family. But yeah, I agree with you. I don't think you want to go chasing everything. I mean, you asked the question earlier, how long can you keep going? You start chasing everything, you know, there's certain Angus breeders that won't use anything except, there's some real interesting examples out of bulls in Scotland that they wouldn't use this bull. None of the major breeders would use him. But whenever he was bred to cows out of the Erica family, that was a top cow family, they'd buy those bulls and had tremendous success. But he himself wasn't out of a prominent cow family, and so he's who made that cow a cow family, but nobody recognized that. If they weren't out of an Erica, for example, which was a herd where he was being used, they had their top cow family. So it's just that kind of thing. I mean, I certainly am not pushing it out the way everything ought to be done on cow family. And again, that just contradicts the what we were talking about a minute ago. Keeping enough bloodlines going so that you don't run into inbreeding problems. And it's a balancing act between those two things. I mean, the fact that yeah, now you know that this particular cow, let's say now she's an 8-year-old and she's had a perfect record and she keeps having, and she's one you decide you're going to start keeping bulls out of, and she happens to have bull calves in the next 7 years and you kept all of them, well, that's the kind of thing you could start running into inbreeding problems. And I realize that's very unlikely for all that combination of things, but that's the kind of thing where you could, and it's just keeping enough breadth in your program where you don't you don't use it all up. And inbreeding is what eventually would cause you to need to think about, well, how long could you go forever? As I said earlier, as long as you don't start chasing individual things like that, I think you can go probably forever. You know what? You're probably not going to live forever, so let's get 20, 30 years out of it. Other things on this. I'm trying to think. I was all prepared for another thing you'd asked me to. Alex was telling me that he sells a lot of bulls to go on Angus cows. And people like those females and they keep them. But what about, rather than breeding them back to Angus bulls, breeding them back to make a second generation Beefmaster? And I think based on what we've just been talking about, the reproductive rate that you can get in these crosses that are, quote, made the right way, I think you could produce some outstanding females. And going back to those 3/4 Beefmaster, quarter Angus, or whatever your base cow is, I think they'd be very, very much worthwhile considering going that second generation. You're still going to, let's say you started with Angus cows, you put that Beefmaster on to begin with, you're going to have all black calves, or your occasional red carrier, but and then you go back with Beefmaster bulls and those black crossbred cows, still half those calves are going to be black. So you got a very marketable product in that 3/4 Beefmaster, quarter Angus, or quarter whatever your British cow is, and that's what you got. And I really don't think you can do anything better than that next generation of Beefmaster on those cows as far as reproduction. And that is the main thing that runs profitability. Everybody always wants to talk about carcass traits. Obviously they're important. You got to have a sellable product. But how many calves you wean affects that commercial producer a whole lot more than the value of the calf. Obviously the value of the calf enters in. I'm not taking anything away from it. But if she doesn't have a calf, she didn't make anything yet. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. That's the question you'd ask, or something, the topic you'd ask me to do. Anything else you want me to talk about? Probably ready to shut up.
Any questions for Dr. Sanders?
Yes, we're just scratching his head.
Brett?
All right, yeah, he's the one that's scratching his head.
All right. Many thanks. Thank you, Dr.
Oh,
Sanders.
enjoy it. All right, that's